The courtroom smelled of polished wood and stale coffee, a cavernous space where echoes of justice were supposed to resonate. Jasmine Crockett stood at the defendant's table, her posture rigid, her dark eyes scanning the room like a hawk tracking a prey. She was no stranger to scrutiny, a woman who'd clawed her way through a world that often tried to bury her under its weight. Today, though, the stakes felt heavier, the air thicker with something unspoken. Across from her, perched on his elevated bench, Judge Malcolm Hargrove loomed, his gray hair thinning, his lips curled into a permanent sneer. He'd presided over this district for decades, a man who wielded gavels like scepters and treated the law as his personal playground. What was it about Jasmine that set his teeth on edge? Was it her unyielding stare, her refusal to shrink under his gaze? Or was there something deeper, something festering beneath his robes that no one dared to name? The case was simple on paper. A property dispute turned ugly, a landlord accusing Jasmine of orchestrating a tenant revolt. She'd represented the tenants pro bono, her voice a lifeline for those drowning in eviction notices. But simplicity had no place here. Hargrove leaned forward, his voice cutting through the hum of the courtroom like a blade. "Miss Crockett," he drawled, dragging her name through the mud of his disdain. "You think you can waltz in here, play hero to the riffraff, and disrespect this court?" The words landed hard, a deliberate jab meant to provoke. Jasmine's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. She'd faced worse than a bitter old man in a black robe. Or had she? Could she have anticipated the storm brewing behind his watery blue eyes? Around her the gallery stirred. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing blood in the water. The tenants she'd fought for sat in the back, their worn faces a silent chorus of hope and fear. Hargrove's taunt wasn't just an insult, it was a gauntlet thrown down in front of them all. "I've seen your kind before," he continued, his tone dripping with venom. "Stirring up trouble, thinking you're above the rules." The accusation hung there sharp and jagged. Was he right? Had Jasmine crossed a line, or was this a desperate man clutching at power he felt slipping away? She adjusted her stance, her heels clicking against the floor, a small sound that somehow carried defiance. She opened her mouth to respond, but Hargrove slammed his gavel, silencing her before she could begin. "You'll speak when I say you can," he snapped, his face reddening. The room held its breath. Jasmine's attorney, a wiry man named Daniel Pierce, shifted beside her, his fingers twitching over his notes. He knew Hargrove's reputation, the whispers of favoritism, the rumors of deals struck in shadowed corners. But proof? That was another matter. What did Hargrove think he could gain by humiliating her? Did he believe she'd crumble, that her resolve would fracture under his scorn? If so, he'd misjudged her. Jasmine's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of this encounter. This wasn't about the case, not really. It was personal, a vendetta dressed up as justice. She met his glare, her silence louder than any rebuttal. The judge smirked, mistaking her restraint for weakness, and that was his first mistake. The clock on the wall ticked forward, each second a thread in a tapestry of tension that was only beginning to unravel. The clock's ticking grew louder in Jasmine's ears, a metronome to the chaos unfolding. Judge Hargrove leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening as if he'd already won some unspoken game. The courtroom, once a place of order, felt like a pressure cooker, the air crackling with the weight of his arrogance. Jasmine's silence hadn't been surrender. It was strategy, a coiled spring waiting to release. She glanced at Daniel, her attorney, who gave her a subtle nod, his eyes flickering with unease. They both knew Hargrove was baiting her, but the why of it gnawed at her. She'd never crossed paths with him before this case, not personally, yet his contempt felt like an old wound reopened. "Miss Crockett," Hargrove said, his voice oily now, "you've got a lot of nerve standing there, acting like you belong. This isn't some street corner rally, this is my courtroom." The jab landed like a slap, and the gallery gasped, a collective intake of breath that rippled through the pews. Jasmine's fingers curled into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. She could feel the tenants' eyes on her, their trust a fragile thread she refused to let snap. Hargrove wasn't just attacking her, he was dismantling their hope, piece by piece. Daniel cleared his throat, rising to object, but Hargrove cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Sit down, counselor, I'm not done," he barked, his authority a blunt instrument. Jasmine's pulse hammered as she watched him, dissecting every word, every gesture. His taunts were too pointed, too rehearsed. This wasn't improvisation, it was a performance, and she was the unwilling co-star. She spoke then, her voice steady, slicing through his tirade. "With respect, Your Honor, this case is about tenants' rights, not my character." The room stilled, her words a quiet rebellion. Hargrove's face twisted, a flash of fury breaking through his mask. "You don't get to lecture me," he spat, slamming his gavel again, the sound a gunshot in the tense silence. "I've been on this bench longer than you've been breathing, girl." The word girl hung there, a deliberate diminishment, and Jasmine felt it like a spark igniting dry grass. She stepped forward, ignoring Daniel's warning hand on her arm. "And in all that time," she said, her tone ice-cold, "have you forgotten what justice looks like?" The question was a dagger, and Hargrove flinched, his composure cracking for the first time. The gallery erupted, murmurs swelling into a low roar as reporters scribbled faster, their pens racing to capture the confrontation. Hargrove pounded, his gavel repeatedly, shouting for order, but the room was slipping from his grasp. Jasmine stood her ground, her gaze locked on his, a silent challenge he couldn't ignore. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a hiss only she could hear. "You'll regret this, Crockett. I'll bury you." The threat landed heavy, a promise wrapped in malice. Jasmine's stomach churned, but she didn't waver. She'd heard worse from men like him, men who thought power was a birthright. But something in his eyes, a glint of desperation, set her mind spinning. Bury her how? With what? The pieces didn't fit, not yet, but she could feel the edges of a larger picture forming. Hargrove straightened, his sneer returning as he regained control of the room. "We'll recess," he declared, his tone clipped. 10 minutes. He rose, robes swishing, and disappeared through the door behind his bench. Jasmine exhaled, her breath shaky but resolute. Whatever he was hiding, she'd find it, and when she did, he'd wish he'd never opened his mouth. The recess stretched the courtroom's tension into a taut wire, ready to snap. Jasmine stood in the hallway, her back against the cool marble wall, her mind racing through Hargrove's threat. "I'll bury you." The words echoed, sharp and venomous, but it was the flicker of panic in his eyes that stuck with her. He wasn't just angry, he was scared, and that made him dangerous. She watched the tenants huddle near the vending machines, their whispers a mix of worry and faith in her. She'd promised them a fight, and now it was personal, a war she hadn't signed up for but couldn't walk away from. Daniel approached, his face tight with concern. "Jasmine, you're poking a bear," he said, his voice low. "Hargrove's got connections, deep ones. You sure you want to push this?" She met his gaze, her resolve hardening. "He pushed first," she replied, her tone clipped. "I'm not here to bow." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair, but he didn't argue. He knew her too well. The hallway buzzed with activity, lawyers and clerks darting past, but Jasmine's focus narrowed to the judge's chamber door. What was Hargrove doing in there? Plotting her ruin or scrambling to cover something up? She didn't have proof, not yet, but her gut screamed that his hostility was a shield, not a sword. The bailiff called them back, and the courtroom filled again, the air heavier now, charged with anticipation. Hargrove re-entered, his stride stiff, his face a mask of forced calm. He avoided Jasmine's eyes as he settled behind the bench, but She could see the sweat beading on his forehead. "Proceed," he said, his voice flat, but there was a tremor beneath it. Daniel began presenting their defense, laying out the tenant's case with precision, but Jasmine barely heard him. Her attention was on Hargrove, on the way his fingers gripped the gavel too tightly, the way his eyes darted to the side door every few seconds. He was unraveling, and she intended to pull the thread. Halfway through Daniel's argument, Hargrove interrupted, his voice rising. "This is nonsense," he snapped, cutting Daniel off mid-sentence. "You're wasting my time with sob stories." The gallery bristled, but Jasmine seized the moment. "If it's nonsense," she said, standing again, "why are you so rattled, Your Honor?" The question hit like a thunderclap, and Hargrove's face flushed crimson. "You're out of line," he roared, slamming the gavel so hard the wood cracked. "One more word, and I'll hold you in contempt." The threat was real, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She leaned forward, her voice steady. "Go ahead, prove my point." The room exploded, gasps and shouts blending into a cacophony. Hargrove stood, his robes billowing, his finger jabbing at her. "You think you're untouchable?" he bellowed. "I've got files, Crockett, files that'll end you." The admission slipped out, raw and unfiltered, and the courtroom froze. Files? What files? Jasmine's heart pounded as she locked eyes with him, seeing the truth he hadn't meant to reveal. He'd overplayed his hand, and she wasn't the only one who noticed. A reporter in the front row bolted upright, phone in hand, already texting. Daniel grabbed her arm, whispering, "Jasmine, he's losing it. We've got him." Hargrove realized his mistake too late, his mouth snapping shut. But the damage was done. He sank back into his chair, his breath ragged, his control slipping through his fingers. Jasmine felt the shift, the tide turning, and she knew this was her chance. Whatever he was hiding, it was big, and it was close. She just had to reach it before he buried her first. The courtroom teetered on the edge of chaos, Hargrove's outburst still reverberating off the walls. His mention of files hung like smoke, thick and suffocating, a confession he couldn't claw back. Jasmine's pulse thundered in her ears, her mind racing to connect the dots. Files that could end her? She had no skeletons worth that kind of threat, no scandals to unearth. This wasn't about her past, it was about his, and he'd just handed her the key. She glanced at Daniel, whose eyes gleamed with the same realization. They didn't need to speak. The plan was already forming. Hargrove slumped in his chair, his face a mask of fury and fear, his hands trembling as he tried to regain the reins. "Order!" he shouted, his voice cracking. But the room ignored him. Reporters typed furiously, their fingers a blur, while the tenants whispered among themselves, sensing a shift they couldn't yet name. Jasmine stepped closer to the bench, her voice cutting through the din. "What files, Your Honor?" she asked, each word deliberate, a scalpel probing a wound. Hargrove's eyes widened, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "You've got nothing," he snarled, but it was weak, a cornered animal's bluff. She pressed harder. "Then why threaten me? What are you hiding?" The gallery leaned in, the air electric with expectation. Hargrove pounded his gavel, the sound desperate now, but Jasmine didn't stop. "You've been on that bench too long," she said, her tone rising. "Twisting justice to protect yourself." It was a gamble, a shot in the dark, but it hit something. Hargrove lurched forward, his face contorted. "You don't know what you're talking about," he roared, but his voice betrayed him, shrill and unsteady. The side door creaked open. Then, and a clerk slipped in. A young woman with wide eyes and a stack of papers clutched to her chest. She hesitated, glancing between Hargrove and Jasmine, her presence a spark in a powder keg. Jasmine seized it. "What's in those papers?" she demanded, pointing at the clerk. The woman froze, her gaze darting to Hargrove, who was on his feet now, his robes flapping as he lunged toward her. "Give me those," he barked, snatching the stack from her hands. The room erupted, shouts of protest rising as he rifled through the pages, his movements frantic. Jasmine saw it then, a flash of something familiar. A logo she'd seen on eviction notices, on the landlord's documents. It clicked. "Those aren't court files," she said, her voice ringing out. "They're payoffs." The accusation landed like a bomb, and Hargrove's hands stilled, the papers slipping from his grasp. They fluttered to the floor, revealing names, dates, dollar amounts, a ledger of corruption laid bare. The gallery surged, reporters scrambling for photos, tenants crying out in disbelief. Daniel grabbed Jasmine's arm, his voice urgent. "He's done, Jasmine. We've got him." But Hargrove wasn't finished. He whirled on her, his face a mask of rage. "You'll pay for this," he hissed, lunging across the bench, his hands outstretched as if to throttle her. The bailiff moved then, a burly man who'd been silent until now, grabbing Hargrove's arms and pinning them behind his back. "That's enough," he growled, his voice a low rumble. Hargrove thrashed, screaming obscenities, but the bailiff held firm. Jasmine stood tall, her breath steadying as the truth sank in. She'd exposed him, stripped him bare in front of everyone he'd ruled over. The clerk sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face, her role in this unraveling clear. The courtroom was a storm, and Jasmine was its eye, unyielding, victorious, but not yet safe. The courtroom descended into a maelstrom, Hargrove's screams cutting through the clamor as the bailiff wrestled him toward the side door. His robes tangled around his legs, a fallen king stripped of his crown, his threats reduced to incoherent shrieks. Jasmine stood rooted, her chest rising and falling with breaths she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The papers lay scattered across the floor, a mosaic of greed and deceit, each page a nail in the coffin of Hargrove's reign. The tenants surged forward, their voices a tide of relief and rage, hands reaching out to touch her, to thank her. She felt their gratitude like a weight, heavy but warm, a reminder of why she'd stood her ground. The bailiff shoved Hargrove through the door, his resistance fading as reality crashed down. Two officers waited beyond, their faces grim, handcuffs glinting in the fluorescent light. "Malcolm Hargrove," one said, his voice flat. "You're under arrest for bribery and judicial misconduct." The cuffs clicked shut, a sound that silenced the room for a fleeting moment, a punctuation mark on decades of corruption. Hargrove twisted, his eyes finding Jasmine through the chaos, wild with hatred. "This isn't over," he spat, but the words were hollow, a dying ember snuffed out by the weight of his own ruin. The officers hauled him away, his shouts echoing, down the hall until they faded into nothing. Jasmine turned to the clerk, who sat hunched, her sobs quiet now, her hands trembling. "You didn't have to do this alone," Jasmine said, her voice soft but firm. The young woman looked up, guilt etched into her features. "He made me," she whispered. "But I kept copies. I wanted out." Jasmine nodded, understanding the cost of courage, the price of breaking free. She reached down, gathering the scattered papers, her fingers brushing names she recognized, families she'd fought for. This wasn't just her victory. It was theirs, a reckoning long overdue. The gallery buzzed, reporters shouting questions, their cameras flashing as Daniel stepped beside her, his face alight with pride. "You did it," he said, clapping her shoulder. "You turned his game against him." She managed a small smile, exhaustion seeping into her bones. But it was the tenants' cheers that lifted her. They crowded the front, tears streaking weathered faces, their voices a chorus of vindication. "You saved us," one woman said, her hands clasping Jasmine's, her grip fierce with gratitude. Another man, older, his eyes bright, added, "He can't hurt us anymore." The words sank deep, a balm to the bruises Hargrove's taunts had left. Order returned slowly, the new judge, a stern woman summoned from another courtroom, taking the bench. She dismissed the landlord's case with a single sentence, her voice cutting through the lingering tension. "Justice has been served," she declared, and the gavel fell, a clean, final note. Jasmine exhaled, the fight draining from her as the room emptied, leaving her with Daniel and the tenants. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the steps where reporters waited, their stories already spinning. She faced them, her head high, her voice steady as she spoke of accountability, of resilience. The cameras rolled, but her eyes were on the tenants, on the future she'd secured. Hargrove was gone, his throne toppled, his threats buried under the weight of truth. Jasmine walked away, not a hero, but a fighter, her triumph etched in the faces of those she'd carried through the storm